Breaking overnight, the president's national security advisor is out. Michael Flynn resigning amid growing fallout from his discussions with Moscow. But big questions remain this morning about who knew what and when about those talks. Live coverage from Washington and Moscow begins right now. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Early Start. I'm Christine Romans.
I'm John Berman. It is Tuesday, February 14th. It is 4 a.m. in the East. Wow. What a night. A flat-out stunning turn of events. A mere 25 days into the Trump administration. 25 days. The president's national security advisor, Michael Flynn, is out. He resigned. The announcement comes amid the mounting evidence that General Flynn spoke to the Russians about sanctions during the transition, then lied about it to top White House officials, including Vice President Mike Pence, who was then Vice President-elect. But now, the questions don't stop with General Flynn. Overnight, we learned that the Justice Department warned the White House last month, about Flynn's contacts with Moscow and his possible vulnerability to blackmail. The White House knew weeks ago. Just one twist in the stunning fall of one of the president's closest confidants. Let's get the very latest from CNN's Ryan Brown, live for us in the nation's capital. Brian, Flynn is out, and now there are questions about what the president knew and when.
Well, that's right, John. What this kind of developed in the waning days of the Obama administration, as you mentioned, during the transition, then acting Attorney General Sally Yates, head of the Justice Department, kind of discovered these conversations that they had not quite adhered to what Flynn and then Vice President-elect Mike Pence had been saying about these conversations between the Russian ambassador Kislyak and Michael Flynn. They had actually had intercepts of these conversations, transcripts, and they were able to look at those and see that sanctions were indeed discussed amongst other issues. Now, there was a discussion within the Obama administration whether or not to inform the incoming Trump team. Then Director of the CIA, John Brennan, and then Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, also wanted to inform the Trump administration. So we believe they were informed that these conversations took place and that they differed from the kind of public accounts that Vice President-elect Mike Pence and Mike Flynn had been talking about. Now, again, this is when it came to what the actual resignation letter that Mike Flynn submitted last night, he specifically mentions that this difference, what he told the Vice President-elect Mike Pence, he said, "I inadvertently briefed the Vice President-elect and others with incomplete information regarding my phone calls with the Russian ambassador. I have sincerely apologized to the President and the Vice President, and they have accepted my apology. I am tendering my resignation, honored to have served our nation and the American people in such a distinguished way." Now, of course, this comes less than a month in his tenure is by far making him the shortest-lived national security advisor in the history of the United States. Now, right now, taking over his responsibilities in an acting capacity will be retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg. He's currently the chief of staff to the NSC. He's a decorated Vietnam veteran and a former commander of the 82nd Airborne. But in terms of filling that role permanently, a senior administration official has told CNN that several names are in the mix, including Kellogg's. Of course, General David Petraeus' name is coming up. He's, of course, well known for leading U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. But, of course, one administration official said he does come with some baggage, given that he is still technically under probation for disclosing intelligence information. And then Vice Admiral Robert Harward, who was Jim Mattis's deputy at Central Command, a former Navy SEAL. His name is also in the mix. So interesting to see who kind of rises to the top in the coming days.
Indeed. You know, it's an important hole to fill. The future here, very important. But I know there will be a lot of questions about what happened over the last month or two as well. Ryan Brown in Washington for us, which is part of the story. Thanks, Ryan.
All right, the resignation of Michael Flynn followed a day of chaos, contradictions, and confusion at the White House, all while the president stayed silent about the fate of his national security advisor. I want to get more from CNN's Dan Merica live in Washington. Just what a head-spinning few hours, quite frankly. We'll hear from the president next, I think, 10:30. There's an event at the White House this morning, so maybe within 6 hours or so he will be compelled to fill us in on some of these unanswered questions. And, Dan, there are a lot of unanswered questions, like what did the White House know when? What did they do with the Justice Department's warning? What did the president know about Michael Flynn's interactions with the ambassador?
I'm actually concerned my head still is spinning. What happened remarkably yesterday was that the pace of this story picked up so quickly in the afternoon. You had Kellyanne Conway, the counselor to the president, telling reporters in the press briefing room that Flynn had the full confidence of the president. And mere hours later, 1 hour later, actually 64 minutes, Sean Spicer issues a statement saying that the president is evaluating the situation. It's remarkable, as Ryan said, that this is the most short-lived national security advisor, but also the fact that we are only in the 4th week of the Trump administration. Now, Donald Trump is verbose at times, likes to be talkative, but yesterday, take a look at this clip. He didn't exactly want to talk about this story in the Oval Office.
Do you have confidence in Michael Flynn, Mr. President?
What exactly will you be evaluating with Michael Flynn?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
What's going to be interesting today is, Donald Trump really hasn't made public statements about this. He's had 2 press conferences since the story came out. Both times he's been asked 4 questions by U.S. media. Not a single time has he been asked about this, in part because he's calling on reporters that are friendly to his administration. Now, what we know is that Flynn resigned. He was not fired, despite the fact that Donald Trump, made his name by firing people. And as one administration official put it, Donald Trump is moving on. He's ready to get past this story and name a successor to Mike Flynn.
That clip, Dan, is certainly pretty awkward. That's Steve Mnuchin, who's just confirmed as the Treasury Secretary. Finally, you've got, sort of the face of the American economy confirmed, but all anybody wants is a comment from the president about Michael Flynn. All right, Dan Merrick, I'll talk to you again very soon. Thank you.
Except during the news conference yesterday, when reporters decided that with the with the National Security Advisor situation in turmoil, they weren't going to ask questions about that. If only there were a news conference yesterday where you could ask the president about it. Oh, wait, there was.
All right, Michael Flynn's resignation is raising troubling new questions about his contacts with Russia. 2 lawmakers are demanding a briefing by Thursday to find out more about the possible vulnerability by blackmail. Democrats John Conyers and Elijah Cummings, ranking members of the Judiciary, the Oversight Committee, writing this. We in Congress need to know who authorized his actions, permitted them, and continued to let him have access to our most sensitive national security information despite knowing these risks. We need to know who else within the White House is a current and ongoing risk to our national security.
The top-ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, writes Flynn's departure does not end questions over his contacts with the Russians. The Trump administration has yet to be forthcoming about who was aware of Flynn's conversations with the ambassador and whether he was acting on the instructions of the president or any other officials or with their knowledge.
One prominent Republican taking a decidedly more gentle tone, Congressman Devin Nunes, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, says Washington, D.C. can be a rough town for honorable people, and Flynn, who has always been a soldier, not a politician, deserves America's gratitude and respect for dedicating so much of his life to strengthening our national security.
Again, remember here, one of the key questions is if the White House was told about this by Sally Yates, by the Justice Department 3 weeks ago, why is it that, as of 4:06 yesterday, Kellyanne Conway was saying Michael Flynn had the full confidence of the president? Where's the discrepancy there? What changed? It's fascinating to know or to think about what happened over the last 3 weeks. The resignation of Michael Flynn will have ripple effects throughout the U.S. security agencies. He needs to be replaced, but also international diplomacy. Then there's the question of Russia. Where are they on this? Let's go live to Moscow, bring in CNN senior international correspondent Matthew Chance. Matthew, just yesterday you were on with us saying the Russians still didn't even admit that sanctions were discussed in those phone calls, or that phone call, over which now Michael Flynn has resigned.
Yeah, no, it's just so embarrassing for the Kremlin, isn't it? I mean, again, just a few minutes ago when I spoke to them on the telephone, they again said, when I said, do you now admit at least that these conversations took place about sanctions? They're like, well, we refer you back to the multiple statements we've made in the past, all of which, of course, were categorical denials that sanctions were discussed. So even now, even after the resignation of Michael Flynn, the Kremlin is sticking to its line that sanctions were not discussed between Michael Flynn and Sergei Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to the United States. What this episode, though, is underlining for the Russians is the problems with having a US president who is so apparently sympathetic towards the Russian view of the world. I mean, the political enemies of Donald Trump, both in the Democratic Party and in the Republicans, have made it clear that they are going to use the apparent sympathies of Donald Trump towards the Kremlin and those around him to undermine his presidency. Michael Flynn is perhaps one victim of that. But here's the real concern in Russia is what will the response be of the Trump administration? I mean, if its political survival is threatened by this, if Trump decides he needs to make peace in some way with Congress, is that going to mean there's going to be a political U-turn on the part of the Trump administration when it comes to Russia, and that he will suddenly become sort of hawkish towards the Kremlin and anti-Russian. That's something the Kremlin are very concerned about now, and there's a lot of people speaking about it. Alexei Pushkov, who's a senior Russian lawmaker here, saying the target of this scandal was not Flynn, but the relationship with Russia. So the view among the upper echelons of the Russian leadership is that Flynn is just a pawn in this. The real target is derailing Trump's ambitions to build a better relationship with Moscow.
And look, there will be congressional investigations that already are into that relationship, possible contacts that happened during the campaign. There are reports that Michael Flynn had contacts with the Russian ambassador prior to the campaign. All that will be investigating going forward. Matthew Chance, fascinating. Great to talk to you this morning. Thanks so much.
So while all the